There is a saying among the old houses of the realm, whispered in the halls of power for longer than anyone could remember: grief makes a person invisible. Give a woman a black veil and a dead husband, and the whole world stops looking at her twice. That was the mistake the council made with Lady Elaine Voss. She arrived at the capital 3 weeks after her husband died, still dressed in mourning, still carrying the particular hollow look of someone who had buried a man the crown had sent to die for it. Her husband, Lord Corwin Voss, had commanded the eastern garrison for 11 years. He'd died, holding a mountain pass against a raiding force 3 times his number, buying 2 extra days for a retreat that saved 4,000 lives. The crown had sent a letter of condolence, a modest pension, and a formality. She was to be seated at the Council of Lords, as was her right as a widow of a service nobility bloodline, in the seat reserved for the lowest-ranking attendee in the chamber, the very back row, the very last chair, the seat nobody wanted because it meant you mattered least. Nobody in that chamber expected her to matter at all. The council chamber of the capital was a vast half-circle of stone and old wood built centuries earlier, when the kingdom was smaller and the lords who ruled its provinces still trusted each other enough to sit in the same room without daggers under the table. It hadn't stayed that way. By the time Elaine walked through its doors, the chamber was a battlefield with better furniture, and everyone in it had spent years learning where the knives were hidden. She was shown to her seat by a page who didn't bother to hide his pity. Last row, far left, half in shadow, half blocked by a support column that had clearly been installed before anyone thought to consider sightlines. It was the seat given to lords who held no true stake in the day's business. The seat for people to be seen, counted, and ignored. Elaine sat. She folded her hands over the small leather portfolio she carried, and she waited. The morning session opened with the usual noise. Border tariffs, grain quotas, a dispute over river rights between 2 minor houses that had apparently been simmering since before Elaine was born. The council's secretary called the roll, reading names in a flat-board drone, checking boxes, moving forward. When he reached her name, he barely looked up. Lady Voss, widow of Lord Corwin Voss, garrison seat, Eastern March. Present. Present, she said, quiet and even. A few heads turned, not many. A ripple of soft murmurs, the kind reserved for something mildly interesting rather than something important. The widow Voss. Poor thing. Husband dead. No children. No house of consequence. Behind her, just a name people remembered from a battle report and would forget again by supper. Someone near the front actually chuckled, low enough to seem private, not low enough to actually be private. Elaine didn't react. She had learned, over 11 years of being a soldier's wife, that reacting to cruelty was often exactly what cruelty wanted. She opened her portfolio instead, and she began, very quietly, to work. The first vote of the morning concerned a proposal from Lord Bracknell, a broad, self-satisfied man who held 3 provinces and had never once, in Elaine's observation, done anything with them except extract taxes and complain about the weather. He wanted an increase in his own garrison funding, framed as border security, though everyone in the room seemed to understand it was mostly about hiring more men to guard his personal estates. The vote came around the chamber seat by seat in the old ritual way. Each lord stated their vote and their proxies if they held any. Most lords held 1 proxy at most. Some inherited authority from a cousin or a childless uncle, a formality more than a power. When the roll reached the back row, the secretary almost skipped her out of habit. He caught himself. "Lady Voss, your vote." "I vote against," Elaine said, "and I cast the proxy of Lord Aldrich Fenn in absentia, also against." The secretary blinked. "Lord Fenn," he repeated. "The proxy registry has Lord Fenn's seat marked vacant." "He passed some years ago." "He did," Elaine said. "His voting writ passed to his eldest surviving kinsman by blood contract, which was his sister. His sister was my husband's aunt. Upon her death last spring, the writ passed to my husband as her nearest living relation with a registered council seat. Upon my husband's death, as his lawful widow and the executor of his estate, the writ passes to me until such time as a male heir of the Voss line reaches majority, which, as the council well knows, does not exist, and so the writ remains mine indefinitely, per the Succession Code, Section 4, concerning proxies without direct heirs. There was a silence in the chamber. It was not a comfortable silence. The secretary looked toward the council chair, an elderly lord named Petrus Hale, who had run these sessions for longer than most of the room had been alive. Hale frowned, adjusted his spectacles, and gestured for the registry to be checked. It took several minutes. Pages were sent scurrying. Elaine sat with her hands folded and waited, betraying nothing, though her heart was hammering harder than she let show. This was the part that mattered. This was the part where either the law held or it didn't. The registry confirmed it. Lord Fenn's writ. Dormant for years. Unclaimed because nobody had bothered to trace the succession through 3 deaths and a marriage, belonged to Lady Elaine Voss. The vote stands corrected, the secretary said, sounding faintly stunned. 2 votes against from the Voss seat. Lord Bracknell's face had gone an unappealing shade of red. He said nothing yet. It was, after all, only 1 extra vote. An oddity, a footnote. He would not think it a footnote by the end of the day. The council moved on, the way councils do, pretending that nothing unusual had happened, though Elaine noticed the murmurs had changed. In tone, less pity now. More curiosity threaded through with the first sour notes of unease. An hour later came the second vote, this one concerning trade rights along the southern coast, a matter that mostly interested the merchant houses and the lords whose provinces bordered the sea. Elaine had no personal stake in it whatsoever, and she said as much when her turn came. "I vote as my own conscience dictates in favor," she said. "And I carry the proxy of Lady Miriam Thorne, deceased, passed through her line to my husband's grandmother, and from her to my husband, and now to me. I vote her proxy in favor as well. And I carry the proxy of Lord Dennock Ashworth, deceased without heir, whose writ was held in trust by the Crown until claimed by a blood relation, which claim my husband made 8 years ago through his mother's line, a claim never revoked. I vote his proxy in favor." The room was no longer murmuring, the room was staring. Petrus Hale set down his pen very slowly. "Lady Voss," he said, and his voice had lost its bored procedural cadence entirely. "How many proxies do you hold?" "I couldn't say with certainty," Elaine answered, and there was something almost apologetic in her tone, though her eyes did not waver. "My husband's family has held a garrison seat for 4 generations. Garrison seats do not marry often outside the service nobility, and service nobility dies young, my lord, more often than it dies old. Somebody has to inherit the writs. Usually it's whoever is left standing. For the last several years that has been my husband. Before that it was his father. Before that his grandmother, who I understand held 11 proxies at the height of her tenure and was known, not always fondly, as the widow's gavel." Somewhere in the chamber, a lord actually laughed. A short, surprised bark, quickly muffled behind a hand. Hale did not laugh. Hale had the look of a man recalculating every decision he'd made that morning. "Continue the session," he said finally, and there was something almost wary in how he said it. The morning wore on, and with each vote, the truth of Lady Elaine Voss unfolded like a slow, deliberate blade being drawn from its sheath. By midday, the tally was becoming difficult to ignore. She held the ancestral proxies of 6 deceased nobles, threads of inheritance so tangled and so old that nobody else in the chamber had bothered to trace them, because nobody had imagined they would ever be worth tracing. Dead lords, whose houses had no other claimants, dead ladies whose bloodlines wound through marriage after marriage, straight into the Voss line. Because service nobility married service nobility, generation after generation, in a small, tight web of families who understood that loving a soldier meant loving someone who might not survive to raise their own children. And so they built their inheritance laws to be resilient against exactly that kind of loss. Elaine's husband had not been merely a garrison commander. He had been, without ever seeking the title, one of the last living threads holding together the voting rights of an entire dying class of minor nobility, families who had given the crown generation after generation of soldiers and received, in exchange, threadbare recognition and inherited paperwork nobody wanted to untangle. And now Elaine held it all. But it did not stop with the dead, After the midday recess, when the council reconvened with a noticeably more attentive energy than it had possessed that morning, a new voice entered the chamber. Lord Ferrous Combe, a wiry, sharp-eyed man who governed a modest but strategically vital province along the northern trade road, requested to be recognized before the next vote. "I wish it entered into record," Combe said, "that I authorized Lady Voss to carry my proxy for the remainder of this session." The chamber erupted into noise for the first time that day. Hale had to strike his gavel twice. "You have your own seat, Lord Combe," Hale said. "There is no cause for you to grant a proxy while you are present in this room." "There is every cause," Combe said, and here his voice hardened, took on an edge that suggested old grievance finally finding its moment. "My father served alongside Lord Corwin Voss for 6 years on the Eastern March. I was raised on stories of a man who gave every soldier under his command his own ration when supply lines failed, who carried wounded men on his own back through snow, who never once asked the crown for more than his men were owed and never once received it. I have sat in this council for 9 years watching lords like Bracknell squeeze more comfort from provinces they've never visited than the crown ever gave the men who died defending them. If Lady Voss intends to speak for the garrison houses today, she may speak for me as well." Bracknell's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Not yet. 2 more came after Combe, before the afternoon session was an hour old. Lady Perrin, Ashdown, whose family had fought beside the Voss line at the Battle of Ketterley Ridge 2 generations back, stood and offered her proxy with a simple nod, saying only that debts of blood were not debts easily forgotten. And Lord Aldismarrow, an old man who had known Elaine's husband as a boy, walked the length of the chamber himself, past the front rows of astonished lords, to stand before her seat in the back and press his ceremonial proxy token into her hand like he was passing down something sacred. "Your husband pulled my son out of a collapsed trench at Varick Pass," Marrow said, loud enough for the whole chamber to hear. "I have owed that boy's life to your family since the day it happened. I never found a way to repay it. Perhaps this is it." Elaine's composure, which had held through every procedural blow and every murmured insult that morning, nearly broke at that. She pressed her lips together, blinked hard, and simply said, "Thank you, my lord. I hope I honor it." By the time the afternoon light had begun slanting long and gold through the high chamber windows, Elaine Voss held 9 proxies beyond her own vote, 6 from the dead ancestral writs nobody else had thought to claim, 3 from the living offered freely out of respect for a man who was no longer there to receive it himself. But the 9th proxy was not the last. It was somewhere past the middle of the afternoon, during a lull as the council debated an obscure matter of river toll enforcement, that a side door near the dais opened, and a young man walked in wearing the unmistakable colors of the royal household. Not the king, not the crown prince, but close enough in blood that every lord in the room straightened in their seats, as though a cold wind had passed through. Prince Julian Ashvale, 3rd cousin to the king, was not a man known for court appearances. He preferred, by long-standing reputation, the company of his hounds and his hunting lodge in the western hills to the tedious business of council votes. His presence alone was an event. His purpose, when he revealed it, silenced the room entirely. "I understand," Julian said, addressing Hale directly, though his eyes swept the chamber and settled for a long moment on the small figure in the back row, "that Lady Voss has been accumulating something of a following today." "That would be an understatement, Your Grace," Hale said dryly. Julian allowed himself a small smile, though it didn't fully reach his eyes. There was something more serious sitting beneath it. "My mother," he said, "was 2nd cousin to Lord Corwin Voss, through the old Ashvale garrison line, before our branch of the family was elevated to royal blood by my grandfather's marriage. That connection has sat dormant for 2 generations because nobody bothered to formally sever it, and nobody bothered to formally use it. I am told that under the ancient council code, a royal proxy may be extended voluntarily to any registered council member of blood relation for a single session, as a courtesy." "That is correct," Hale said slowly, "though it has not been invoked in living memory. Then let it be invoked now, Julian said. I extend my council proxy, for the remainder of this session, to Lady Elaine Voss. The silence that followed was total. Even the scribes stopped writing. Elaine sat very still in her chair at the back of the room, the small leather portfolio open in her lap, 9 proxy tokens and now a 10th arranged before her with the same careful order a soldier might use to arrange her husband's medals. She had not asked for this. She had come to the capital grieving, expecting to sit quietly in the seat the crown assigned her, expecting perhaps to be politely ignored for the rest of her natural life the way widows of dead garrison commanders usually were. She had not expected the truth of her own bloodline and her husband's to rise up around her like a tide nobody else had bothered to measure. But there it was. Julian gave her a short, formal bow, the kind reserved for equals, and took his seat near the front, close enough to Bracknell that the older lord visibly leaned away from him. The chamber tried, for a while, to pretend it could go on as normal. It could not. The next vote concerned the very garrison funding that had opened the day. Bracknell's proposal to expand his personal forces under the banner of border security. It had been expected to pass easily. Bracknell had spent weeks courting votes, calling in favors, making the kind of quiet promises that greased the wheels of every council session Elaine had heard about even before she arrived. When the roll came to her, the chamber had gone so quiet that her voice, though soft, carried to every corner of the room. I vote against, she said, and I carry against it the proxies of Lord Aldrich Fenn, Lady Miriam Thorne, Lord Dennick, Ashworth, Lord Cassian Vane, Lady Odette Rourke, Lord Tiberius Grey. She paused only to breathe. That is 6 votes from the dead, my Lord Secretary, all of them mine by lawful inheritance, all of them against. She continued, and her voice did not shake. I carry as well the proxies freely given by Lord Ferrascombe, Lady Perrin Ashdown, and Lord Aldous Marrow, all voting against by their own word given today, in this chamber, before witnesses. The secretary's pen had stopped moving entirely. And I carry, Elaine said, and here, for the first time, something colder entered her voice, something that had been waiting all day beneath the grief and the quiet patience. The proxy of His Grace Prince Julian Ashvale, extended to me this afternoon under the ancient council code, also voting against. She folded her hands. That is 11 votes against Lord Bracknell's proposal. My Lord Secretary, including my own. Lord Bracknell shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped back and nearly toppled. This is absurd, he snapped. This is a parlor trick. A widow's parlor trick. Dredging up dead men's paperwork to inflate her own voice in this chamber. I have sat on this council for 20 years. I will not be lectured on procedure by a garrison wife who arrived 3 weeks ago. The chamber held its breath. Elaine did not raise her voice. She had learned in 11 years, married to a soldier, that raising your voice was often exactly what men like Bracknell wanted, because it let them frame you as hysterical instead of correct. My lord, she said evenly, every proxy I have cited today is recorded in the council's own registry, verified by your own secretary, under laws your own council wrote, and has enforced for longer than either of our lifetimes. If the procedure is absurd, my lord, it was absurd before I ever walked into this chamber. I have simply been the first person in some years to bother reading it. Somewhere near the middle rows, someone made a small, sharp sound that might have been a laugh quickly swallowed. Bracknell's face had gone from red to something closer to purple. The garrison houses, he said, have always been a convenient fiction for this council. Dead men's votes propping up a system too sentimental to retire them. It is precisely this kind of accumulated, unearned influence that clogs this chamber and slows this crown's business to a crawl. It was the wrong thing to say, and every lord in the room seemed to feel it land wrong at the same moment. Lord Combe stood. Unearned, he repeated very quietly, and there was an edge in his voice now that hadn't been there before. My Lord Bracknell has never once set foot east of the capital in the 9 years I have sat on this council. Lord Corwin Voss died, holding a mountain pass so that 4,000 of this kingdom's people could retreat to safety. If my Lord Bracknell wishes to discuss what this council does and does not consider earned, I invite him to say so, again more plainly, so that it may be recorded. Bracknell did not say it again. Petrus Hale, watching the temperature of the room rise past anything he'd overseen in years, struck his gavel twice, hard. "Enough," he said. "The vote stands as recorded. 11 against, and however many in favor remain once the roll concludes, though I suspect," he added with the faint, dry note of a man watching his own predictions collapse in real time, "that the outcome is no longer in serious doubt." It was not in doubt. The proposal failed decisively, and Lord Bracknell sat back down in a silence that had nothing conciliatory in it at all. The session continued into the late afternoon, and something in the chamber had shifted permanently. The way a room shifts once everyone in it has watched the balance of power change hands and knows there's no pretending otherwise. Vote after vote, Elaine's tally was called. And vote after vote, the number she carried settled the outcome before the rest of the chamber had finished speaking. She was careful, scrupulously careful, to vote each proxy according to what she genuinely believed its holder would have wanted, consulting the notes in her portfolio. Small handwritten records she had clearly spent weeks preparing, cross-referencing old letters and family histories to understand not just what she could vote, but what she should. It was. Several of the older lords began to remark quietly among themselves, exactly the kind of care Corwin Voss himself had always been known for: thoroughness, fairness, a refusal to wield power carelessly, even when he held enormous amounts of it. By the time the late afternoon light had gone thin and amber through the tall windows, something had happened in that chamber that none of the pages, none of the scribes, and certainly none of the lords could remember happening before. One by one, other lords began finding reasons to leave. It started subtly. A lord near the front claimed a prior engagement and asked to be excused before the next vote, quietly instructing the secretary to record his position by written proxy, rather than remain to be present for what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable referendum on his own relevance. Another followed shortly after, citing a letter that required urgent attention. A third simply gathered his papers and left without offering any explanation at all, his expression carefully blank, in the particular way of a man who did not want to be the next to be publicly outvoted by a widow in the back row. It was not fear of Elaine herself, precisely. It was the slow dawning recognition among the lesser lords of the chamber that the day's business had stopped being about tariffs and trade routes and had become instead a referendum on which of them had built genuine loyalty in their years of service, and which of them had simply accumulated titles and comfort, while men like Corwin Voss bled for the kingdom. In mountain passes nobody else cared to visit. Nobody wanted to be the next name called, only to watch their proposal quietly crumble beneath the weight of 11 votes from a woman they dismissed that morning as a footnote. By the time the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western hills, visible through the tall chamber windows as a deepening amber wash across the old stone floor, the council chamber, that had begun the day nearly full, held perhaps a third of its original attendance. Seats that had been occupied that morning by lords murmuring pity and amusement now sat empty, their occupants gone home, or gone to write hasty letters to allies, or simply gone to sit somewhere quieter and reconsider the shape of their own influence. The back row, once the emptiest, least respected place in the entire chamber, was the only row from which a voice still reliably shaped the outcome of every vote called. Petrus Hale, watching the chamber empty itself around him with an expression that had shifted over the course of the day, from bemusement to something closer to respect, finally called the last item of business as the light through the windows turned the deep gold of early evening. "There is one matter remaining," he said, "concerning the reallocation of Eastern garrison funding for the coming year, in light of Lord Voss's death and the vacancy of Eastern command." He paused and looked down the length of the chamber past the now sparsely occupied rows to the small figure still seated in the back, portfolio open, spine straight, exactly as she had been that morning. "Lady Voss," Hale said, and his voice had changed entirely from the flat procedural drone with which he'd greeted her at dawn. "Given the matter at hand concerns the very garrison your husband commanded, and given the considerable weight of proxy you have demonstrated yourself to carry today, the council would hear your position first. It was not procedure." procedure called votes from the front of the room to the back, by rank, by seniority, by every calcified tradition that had built this chamber's hierarchy over centuries. It was, in fact, precisely backward from how the entire day had opened, when her name had barely warranted a glance. Elaine looked up. For the first time since she'd entered that chamber that morning, something in her composure wavered, just slightly, just enough for the Lord still present to see the grief that had been sitting quietly beneath all of it the entire day, patient, unaddressed, waiting for a moment when the woman wearing it could finally afford to feel it. She stood. It was a small thing, standing, but nobody in that chamber had seen her stand all day, and something about the simple, unhurried way she rose from the back row seat made the room go very still. "My Lord Hale," she said, and her voice, though quiet, reached every corner of the chamber, carried by the peculiar acoustics of old stone and the particular silence that only comes when everyone present has finally decided to actually listen. "This morning I was given a seat in the back of this chamber because the Crown believed my voice carried little weight. I did not come here to prove the Crown wrong. I came here, if I am honest, because it was the only chair offered to me, and because my husband spent 11 years believing that showing up, even to rooms that did not want him, was the whole of a soldier's duty. I only tried to do the same." She paused and let her eyes move slowly across the room, across the empty seats, across the handful of lords who remained. "I did not ask for 6 dead men's votes. I inherited them because nobody else thought to trace where they belonged, and because the men and women who once held them believed, rightly or wrongly, that a garrison family would use that inheritance more carefully than it might otherwise be used. I did not ask for the trust of Lord Combe or Lady Ashton or Lord Marrow. They gave it freely, because they remembered a man who spent his life making sure the debts of blood in this kingdom were paid honestly, even when the Crown itself was slow to pay them. And I certainly did not ask for the proxy of a prince. That, I suspect, was given because His Grace understood, faster than most in this room, which way the wind was turning, and chose correctly. A few lords actually laughed at that, low and startled, and even Julian, seated near the front, allowed himself a broader smile than before. "My position on Eastern garrison funding," Elaine continued, "is simple. The men who serve on that border are not decorative. They are not a line item to be trimmed when a council session runs long and the treasury runs short. My husband commanded 800 soldiers on that mountain pass with equipment that was, by the time he died, 11 years out of date, because funding requests from the Eastern March had been quietly deprioritized in this very chamber for over a decade in favor of proposals like the one Lord Bracknell offered this morning. I vote, and I cast the votes of every proxy I hold today in full, for the restoration of Eastern garrison funding to the level my husband requested 3 years ago and was denied." She looked directly at Bracknell as she said the next part. "I understand this will mean less funding available for private estate security elsewhere in this kingdom. I am, I confess, entirely at peace with that outcome." The vote, when it was finally tallied, was not close. It was not close in the way that a landslide is not close, in the way that history sometimes simply decides in a single afternoon which direction it intends to move, and dares anyone still standing in the room to argue otherwise. Eastern garrison funding was restored in full, with an additional allocation for equipment modernization that the council, exhausted and thoroughly rearranged by the day's events, passed with barely any further debate at all. Petrus Hale struck his gavel a final time as the light outside had gone from gold to the deep blue of early evening. "This session is closed," he said, and then, after a pause, added something that was not strictly procedural at all. "Lady Voss, on behalf of this council, belated as it is, my condolences for your husband, and my apologies for this morning's seating arrangement. I suspect it will require reconsideration." Elaine inclined her head. "Thank you, my lord, though I confess I've grown rather fond of the back row. The light is better than people expect." It was a dry thing to say, and it startled a genuine laugh out of several lords still present, the kind of laugh that comes when tension finally has somewhere honest to go. She gathered her portfolio, the small stack of proxy tokens, the notes and letters. She had spent weeks preparing in a quiet house in the eastern hills, while grief sat beside her like a second occupant at every meal. She walked the length of the chamber alone, past rows that had emptied one by one over the course of the day, past the handful of lords who remained, several of whom rose from their seats as she passed, an old formal gesture of respect that had clearly not been offered to her that morning. Prince Julian met her near the door. "You did not need my proxy, you know," he said quietly, "so it wouldn't carry. You had already carried the vote before I walked in." "Perhaps," Elaine said. "But your Grace's proxy meant the difference between a chamber that could dismiss the outcome as an accumulation of forgotten paperwork and a chamber that had to reckon with the fact that even the crown's own blood recognized what my husband's family was worth. That mattered more than the vote count, I think." Julian studied her for a long moment. "My mother spoke of the garrison houses sometimes," he said. "She said they were the spine of this kingdom, holding up a body that mostly forgot they were there until something broke." "That sounds like her," Elaine said softly. "I never met her. I wish I had." Outside, the evening air was cool and smelled faintly of rain not yet arrived. The kind of early autumn evening that used to mean Corwin would be home soon from drilling the garrison, tired and smiling and smelling of horse and leather and the particular exhaustion of a man who loved his work even when it cost him everything. Elaine stood at the top of the council steps for a long moment, looking out over the Capitol, its lamps just beginning to flicker to life in the blue dusk, and allowed herself, finally, after a full day of careful composure, to simply breathe. She had not come to that chamber seeking power. She had come because it was owed to her. Quietly, as a formality, a courtesy extended to a grieving widow that nobody expected her to actually use. But grief, she had learned over 11 years of loving a man who might not come home, did not make a person powerless. It simply made them patient. And patience, applied carefully, applied honestly, to a system that had forgotten to check its own paperwork for longer than anyone could remember, was its own kind of quiet, devastating force. She descended the steps into the gathering dark, and somewhere behind her, in the empty council chamber, the pages were already rewriting the seating chart for the following morning. The back row, as it turned out, would need considerably fewer chairs. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for a quiet widow turning grief into justice one proxy at a time, let me know down in the comments which moment landed hardest for you. Was it Lord Marrow crossing the whole chamber to press his token into her hand? Or was it Bracknell's face when the votes finally came due? I read every comment, and I love hearing which parts hit home. If you enjoyed this one, there are more stories like it waiting for you. Tales of quiet people carrying more strength than anyone around them ever gave them credit for, and the reckonings that follow when the world finally notices. Consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Lady Voss. Until next time, take care of each other, and remember that the quietest seat in the room isn't always the emptiest one.